So you excited, Shadi?
I'm pretty excited, Damir. This is big. We have a very special guest. Glenn Greenwald is joining us.
Well, yes, joining us. Yes, technically for our listeners, but yes, joining us soon.
Because we actually talked to him yesterday, and we're just doing a little intro so you know what to expect. We covered a lot, and there was a lot we wanted to talk to Glenn about. He is probably one of the most well-known, even famous.
Controversial. I think maybe the most controversial. Well, certainly for our podcast. But anyway, one of the most controversial. Go on.
Yeah, journalists in the U.S., but also more broadly. There were a number of things that we wanted to talk about. We did cover a lot of ground, so we're dividing this into two parts. Part one is available to all of you for free, and we hope you enjoy it. Part two will be available for subscribers only. So we would encourage you to consider subscribing and supporting our work. We think part two is really good too. And just to give you a little bit of a heads up, in part two, we talk about whether Glenn considers himself a man of the left, wokeness, American exceptionalism, whether the left has certain blind spots about autocrats. And a cool one that we ended with, I just felt like, hey, let me ask Glenn a sort of unusual question, which was whether he would ever consider serving in government. And I brought up the example of a hypothetical fantasy Bernie Sanders administration. And I actually wasn't sure what he would say on that. So I think he'll find that interesting. So if you do want to subscribe, you can do that by going to wisdomofcrowds.live/subscribe. In addition to this additional part with Glenn Greenwald, you'll also have access to other paid content, our weekly Friday essay, and other members-only bonus podcasts. So with that, Damir, a final word before people here.
I just want to say you are a master marketer, Shadi, and hats off to you. I hope you guys enjoy. First part is real good, but the second part's real juicy too. So hopefully you'll become subscribers soon. Enjoy.
I think people like to see the behind the scenes stumbling before the show begins.
Exactly.
So.
I mean, in a way, our entire show is behind the scenes stumbling.
I know the feeling.
Glenn, I just realized that we've been in touch over Twitter for such a long time, like DMs and just like going back and forth publicly. But I don't think I've ever talked to you directly. So it's nice to actually do that for the first time.
Yeah, you too. It's always strange when you know people. There's so many years, from kind of just the place you go to work, and then you realize you've never actually had normal, civilized, direct conversation with them. So.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, we've done one with Andrew Sullivan recently, and with Megan McArdle, and honestly, it's this sort of generation of bloggers that for me anyway. I mean, it was just it's sort of synonymous with the rise of internet writing. You and Andrew and Megan. So again, it's a real treat to have you on.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate you guys asking me.
Yeah, so maybe we'll get started. I don't know exactly when we'll start in. So if you heard someone, let me just say that we have a very special guest for this episode. We're really excited about it. Glenn Greenwald is joining us. We have a lot to talk about. I mean, Glenn probably doesn't need much of an introduction, but I'll just say a few highlights. As many of you will know, he is the founder of The Intercept. He has a relatively recent Substack, which I'd encourage you to check out. And he has a new book out. It's called Securing Democracy, My Fight for Press Freedom and Justice in Brazil. And it will include links to the book and to Glenn's Substack in the show notes. So maybe, we'll start with the book. I mean, it's a fascinating book, and it's quite personal. That, Glenn, you found yourself becoming almost a household name in Brazil in a way. And I think the story of what happened to you has a lot of implications for how we think about democracy more broadly, free speech, and the role that journalists play in a democracy. And you're obviously a controversial figure in American politics to some extent. And I feel like almost every time I go on Twitter, I see people attacking you. But that didn't prepare me for learning about what you've had to go through being an outspoken critic of the president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, the far-right president. It's a whole different level. You have to live with a full security team. You don't go out except with an armed guard. One of your close friends was assassinated, so on and so forth. So maybe I just wanted to start with the figure of Bolsonaro, who figures very prominently in the book. And you make a really interesting point that I hadn't quite thought of before in the early pages. You talk about how when we as Americans talked about Bolsonaro as the Brazilian Trump or the Trump of the tropics, that was actually quite misleading because it actually served to normalize Bolsonaro and make him seem like he was just another Trump-like figure. And when you actually go into Bolsonaro's history, he makes Trump look like a Boy Scout pretty much. And I can't believe some of the things that Bolsonaro has actually said, and I won't repeat them. First of all, because they're very bad, but also because I don't know if I could do justice through a mere paraphrasing. So I'm just, I'm curious, like how would you sort of describe Bolsonaro for those casual observers who have only followed him from afar and don't have a good sense of who he is? And maybe bring some of your own personal experience and what basically he and his cronies were trying to do to you, because it's not just his allies who were attacking you. Bolsonaro himself has gone out of his way to attack you personally.
Yeah, it's interesting, this framing of Bolsonaro as the Trump of the tropics, because it is so misleading. And I was arguing that from the inception of this narrative, which I understood from the perspective that the Western press doesn't pay a lot of attention to Latin America, nor do their audience. And so they were trying to convey who he was with a reference point to something they did know. So I understood the impetus behind it. And it is wildly misleading for reasons I'll explain in just a second. But it did have also this unintentional consequence of really boosting Bolsonaro. He wanted that label applied to him, that he was the Trump of Brazil. For no other reason than that Brazilians have been told for decades that they're a third world country, they're a developing country, they're a poor country, things don't go right in Brazil. And so for them to be told that they have the opportunity to elevate to the presidency somebody who is essentially nothing more than the Brazilian version of the person who is of the rich and most powerful country in history seemed appealing to a lot of people. They were being told by the Brazilian media that Bolsonaro is this figure that's completely inept and extremist and pernicious, all of which is true. But then they're hearing from the Western press, well, no, he's just like Trump. And to them, it kind of normalized Bolsonaro. They said, well, how far outside the mainstream can he be if he's just like the person that was elected by the most powerful and most important and influential democracy on the planet? So it had that unintended effect, I think, of not just normalizing, but strengthening him. And leaving aside the differences that are really profound and important, not just between Bolsonaro and Trump, but Bolsonaro and I think most of these kind of, for lack of a better term, new right leaders that we're seeing emerging throughout Western democracies, whether it's Marine Le Pen or Nigel Farage, or just some of these kind of hybrid right-wing groups like in Italy and in Greece and in Spain that are even finding some common ground with the left. Bolsonaro is really a throwback to the Cold War type of far-right authoritarian that the U.S. was so fond of supporting. But I think we have to leave aside the differences between the two people, Trump and Bolsonaro, for a minute to understand, more importantly, the reason why I objected so much was because Brazil and the United States are such profoundly different countries that even if those two were the same, which they're not, but even if they were, the fact that they're in these two extraordinarily different countries with different institutional histories and cultural and political ethoses and just the kind of threats that can be posed in terms of authoritarianism in each, it's already wildly inaccurate and misleading to start trying to equate them. And what I mean by that is, the United States, for whatever else you want to say about it, for whatever criticisms one might have of it, is a very old and stable democracy. It's 235 years, depending on how you count. It's endured a civil war, all kinds of internal strife, the Cold War, multiple wars, and for better or worse, the democratic institutions have more or less stayed stable. And that places very hard limits, concrete hard limits on what a particular political official, like even the elected president, can do in terms of making incursions into core democratic values. Whereas Brazil is exactly the opposite. It's a very new democracy. It redemocratized only in 1985, elected its first president through direct elections only in 1989, so basically 30 to 35 years. And on top of that, it's been battered by economic crises and extreme poverty and corruption. So the institutions on which you would rely to place limits and checks on an authoritarian leader who rose to power are much more fragile and much weaker, even beyond the question of whether they have the actual will to place those limits and defend democratic values. And that was why, just independent of the differences, Bolsonaro and Trump seemed so radically different to me in terms of the dangers that they pose. But I think the recent history of Brazil is crucial to understanding anything about what's happening with Bolsonaro. In 1963, 62, 63, Brazil really started having this burgeoning democracy. And they were steadfastly devoted to the idea that they were going to remain neutral in the Cold War between Moscow and Washington, never gravitate toward the influence of one or the other, because they knew that any country that did that ended up regretting it. So they really were trying to maintain this steadfast neutrality. And they elected a center-left government, not anything close to a communist government or a socialist government, just kind of a center-left reformist government. And the president started doing very mild reforms like instituting rent control and renationalizing some industries that had been privatized and pulled off to international interest to make Brazil's resources work for the Brazilian people. But that was the height of the Cold War, right? The Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Eisenhower era that ushered in the U.S. security state. And so even those mild reforms were intolerable to Washington, that still very much believed in the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that Central America and Latin America, South America are in their backyard and are theirs to control. And they warned the Brazilian government multiple times, you're going too far. And if they, weren't willing to change policies to placate first the Kennedy and then the Johnson administration. And so in 1964, the CIA, working with right-wing generals, engineered a military coup. They drove the elected president out of the country to Uruguay within about 24 hours. And that ushered in a 21-year military dictatorship that was incredibly brutal. All the things that dictatorships do. They killed dissidents, they imprisoned journalists, they exiled artists, they, ushered in repressive decrees that essentially eliminated all civil liberties. And it wasn't until 1985 very popular support, but Jair Bolsonaro was formed in that military dictatorship. He was a young army captain. And even once Brazil redemocratized, began electing its leaders, he had spent 30 years as a congressman from Rio de Janeiro, elected president. And he rose to prominence because he was so kind of deranged and so far outside the mainstream that the media couldn't take their eyes off him. He's also charismatic, but he would openly advocate the idea that military dictatorship was a superior form of government to democracy, and would say things like, if I'm ever elected president, the first thing I would do is close the Congress, and then the next day I would close the Supreme Court. He said the only thing that the military dictatorship did wrong, that he criticizes them for, is they tortured a lot of people but didn't kill enough dissidents. So he's an open, authoritarian, much closer to, if you want to find a contemporary model, much closer to, say, General Sisi in Egypt or President Duterte than he is to Donald Trump or any Western new right leaders.
But the interesting thing, Glenn, is that as you said, it's so much of that has to do with the institutional. Well, I mean, the call it the maturity of the democracy, but the institutional maturity of it, right? I mean, in many ways, Trump said horrible things throughout. So, I mean, maybe one thing we might ask you to do just to sort of orient our listeners is to just sort of give a little quick bit about the structure of the book and actually your big scoop in all of this. I mean, I really do want to talk about Brazilian politics because I think the book was actually super useful for me, and I'd love to talk about the Cold War element of it. But it's and maybe we can talk about Brazilian politics through this. What's fascinating about the book is you're handed basically another scoop. You even identify it early on as almost the equivalent of the career-wise for you professionally and as far as like a journalistic satisfaction, the equivalent of the Snowden scoop. And it has to do with basically the collusion of one of the main, at the time considered anti-corruption judges in Brazil with this basically right-wing strand of Brazilian politics. So maybe as you talk a little bit about that for our listeners to orient them, maybe you can also talk a little bit about Brazilian politics, because that's one of the things that both, in the book I think is really interesting, but I also have some more questions about it, about, how one ought to think about this, especially with everything you talked about, both the history, but this question of populism and democracy and what's actually happening in the world today. So I don't know, maybe you can say a few words there.
Sure. So, I definitely wrote the book for an international audience, for an American audience, Western European audience. And I didn't even conceive of it as a book about Brazil per se. I conceived of it as an attempt to put Brazil under the microscope with the intention of drawing lessons about patterns that are happening throughout the democratic world. Because it is so interesting and to many people confounding that Brazil was a country that elected a center-left or even left-wing party, the Workers' Party, which was a party created by a former very charismatic labor leader, Lula da Silva, who became president of the country from 2002 until 2010. And after he was term limited out of office, his successor, handpicked successor, Dilma Rousseff from the same party, was elected and then reelected. So for 4 consecutive national elections, they voted for and were governed by a center-left party. And then suddenly there's this massive shift to Bolsonaro, and the question that a lot of people have is why. And I think analyzing the reasons why that happened tells you a lot, not just about Brazil, but about Brexit and Trump and Marine Le Pen and these trends that we see throughout the democratic world, not just in Brazil. So the really critical event is that, as I said, it was Lula, who really is like one of the giants of the last part of the 20th century, early part of the 21st century. When he was elected in 2002, there was a lot of mistrust about him in the international community. They thought he was going to be another Castro or another Chavez. But he really governed as this kind of moderate leftist. And, Brazil grew very rapidly economically for the 8 years that he governed. They passed the UK and many other countries, became the 6th largest economy in the world. The rich did really well, but millions of people were lifting out of poverty. That was when Brazil got the World Cup and the Olympics, this kind of symbolic event that showed that Brazil had finally arrived as the country that people had always expected it to be. And when he left office, he had an 87% approval rating, 87%, unheard of in a democracy that size and complexity. And so in 2017, everybody knew he was planning to run again for president. In 2018, the term limits are you can't serve more than 2 consecutive terms, but then you can serve a 3rd term as long as you have an interval. And all opinion polls showed that he was almost certain to win. We had a 15, 20-point lead over all other candidates, including Bolsonaro. And while that was happening, there was this huge anti-corruption probe that was led by this judge, Sergio Moro, and he's a young judge, and this team of young prosecutors, and they were sending billionaires to prison and political leaders mostly from left-wing parties, but some centrist parties, prison. And a lot of people started thinking that this corruption probe, which had taken over Brazil, Sergio Moro became the most popular person in Brazil by far. He resided above political figures. You would go to any city in Brazil and see huge murals of him on the side of buildings. They would depict him as Superman. He was the only Brazilian to make the Time 100 list in 2016. So he became this huge figure. And in 2017, as Lula was getting ready to run for what was almost certain to be a winning presidential run, they brought extremely dubious corruption charges against him that even a lot of supporters of Sergio Moro in this probe were very skeptical of. But Judge Moro found Lula guilty in a very short period of time and sentenced him to a decade in prison. And an appellate court that was notoriously subservient to Moro, most institutions were, they were afraid of him. He had an army of popular support behind him, affirmed that conviction. And when they did, it rendered Lula ineligible to run under the law. And so Moro removed Bolsonaro's primary obstacle to the presidency, which was Lula, by finding him guilty on these very sketchy charges. And then Bolsonaro in 2018 cruised to victory. He easily defeated the other Workers' Party candidate who Lula from prison had handpicked. And the first thing that Bolsonaro did after winning the presidency, before he was inaugurated, was he turned around, he offered Judge Moro a very important position in his government as Minister of Justice. And at the time, Moro, again, was the most popular, the most powerful figure in Brazil. He negotiated that all powers of investigation, surveillance, law enforcement be consolidated under his command. And Brazilian press started calling him a super minister. And he went and joined the government, kind of giving credence to the long-held suspicion on the left that he was really a right-wing figure all along, bent on destroying the Workers' Party. And so about 4 months after Bolsonaro's inauguration, it was on Mother's Day in 2019. He was inaugurated January 1st, 2019. He was at the peak of his power. He had just won the decisive victory. His far-right party that barely existed before 2018 was ushered into power. They were the second largest party behind the Workers' Party in Congress. He had Sergio Moro with him. His popularity was sky high. People were petrified of what he was going to do. And I got contacted by this source who said that he had hacked into the Telegram accounts, which is like an encrypted app that Brazilian officials all were using, and downloaded years and years worth of chats and documents and photos and audios and videos of the most important people in Brazil, including Judge Moro and all of these prosecutors. And he told me that it revealed grave corruption on their part that would shatter Brazil at its foundations. And I worked with him for a good while to create a climate of trust, began receiving this archive, quickly realized it was going to be bigger than the Snowden archive in terms of its size. At the time, the Snowden leak was the biggest leak in modern journalistic history. This was larger. And after about 3 weeks, we had found so much shocking evidence, like really bombastic evidence of grave corruption, that the way Sergio Moro was conducting these trials of Lula, but others as well, was entirely corrupt. He was plotting with the prosecutors the whole time, that he was pretending to sit in judgment of them. He broke the law in numerous cases in order to find them guilty, in order to obtain evidence. And when we began doing this reporting, it really destabilized the Bolsonaro government because Sergio Moro was the anchor of its legitimacy. And about 3 months after we began, the Supreme Court ordered Lula freed from prison. It didn't exonerate him yet, but it ordered him freed from prison, which was a political earthquake here in Brazil. And then just recently, within the last month, the Supreme Court ruled that Sergio Moro never should have had the case to begin with, that they cheated to make sure it stayed with him, knowing that he would find Lula guilty. And then they actually concluded that he himself, based on our reporting, was corrupt and acting with extreme bias and political motives the entire time. And so they exonerated Lula, they nullified his conviction, restored his political rights, and he's now capable of running against Bolsonaro in 2022, which everyone expects him to do. So Brazil will have that choice, Bolsonaro versus Lula, that everyone thought we would have in 2018, but were denied as a result of this rampant corruption.
But Glenn, you mentioned in the book, and this is, I think, key to sort of get us talking about this sort of stuff. But you mentioned in the book, in fact, that Bolsonaro Some like to think that had Lula been able to run, he would have been able to forestall Bolsonaro's rise. But in fact, you point to the fact that his rise was accompanied with all sorts of wins by these right-wing guys, across the country, that there was something else afoot here, like a kind of societal frustration that was driving a lot of this. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a really important point, and I'm glad you mentioned it. It is true that all polls showed that Lula was, likely to beat Bolsonaro. But remember, in 2016, all polls also showed that Hillary Clinton was overwhelmingly likely to defeat Trump, and she didn't. And so I always say that I'm not at all confident that even had Lula run, he would have beaten Bolsonaro, because I think it was just Bolsonaro's moment. And, it's really interesting. Not only did Bolsonaro spend all those years praising a dictatorship, he also combines this religious fervor with the anti-LGBT animus as one of his primary political programs, this kind of authoritarian, let's just go kill all the criminals, ideas that never really were popular in Brazil. It's not a right-wing country. And I started noticing, in 2017 and 2018, even friends of ours, black people, working class people, people in the favelas, LGBTs themselves, started slowly coming out of the closet and saying, I think I'm considering voting for Bolsonaro. And that was when I really started thinking that he was going to win. And I think that he won not because of his right-wing extremism and some of his kind of demented bigotry and, ideas that are offensive to almost anybody decent, but despite them. By that point, Brazil had gone through this huge corruption scandal that was unfolding. In 2016, Dilma Rousseff, the Workers' Party president, was impeached. That was a huge political crisis. The effects of the 2008 financial crisis that started on Wall Street started reverberating in developing countries, into her presidency. And by the time they impeached her, there was a massive economic and unemployment crisis, millions and millions of people unemployed. So much of the progress that had been made under Lula, the emergence of this middle class, kind of disappeared. Those people fell back into poverty. With that came an enormous epidemic of violent crime, so that the chances of a police officer in Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo being murdered on the job is higher than the probability that a U.S. soldier would have died in Baghdad or in the Sunni Triangle at the height of the Iraq War. It's like war zone level violence. And so when you do that to people's lives, right, when you destroy their economic security, erase and dash their hopes, make them frightened that when they send their kids to school in the morning, they're not going to come back because of indiscriminate gun violence, and essentially ruin the entire country and make people perceive that the ruling elite is benefiting and has nothing but contempt, not just indifference, but contempt for everybody else. You set the stage for a demagogue to come and position himself as the enemy of the establishment. And the more that Bolsonaro got attacked by the establishment media that people had come to hate, by bankers and by, establishment figures, the more popular he became, because so much of the country was driven by rage and anger that they didn't think Bolsonaro was going to save them, but they were just acting out of desperation. They thought, well, it can't be worse than the status quo. And if he's promising to burn down this system that we hate and has been so bad for our lives, that seems like it's worth gambling on. And that, to me, is the same thing that explains how you have millions of voters who voted for Obama by promising to usher in change and, radically revising how Washington works, who then voted for Trump in 2016, who also ran as an outsider. Same thing with Brexit, millions of angry people who didn't necessarily believe Brexit would improve their lives, but who did it anyway to kind of spite the ruling class. I think that's one of the things that is the most important thing to realize about what happened in Brazil and that brought us Bolsonaro is, if you have an ideology like neoliberalism or globalism that is running roughshod over a huge portion of the population, the anger and rage that they're ultimately going to embrace validly at some point will be directed or weaponized by a talented demagogue, regardless of ideology. They don't, people who voted for, it doesn't make sense for professional political people like us that someone could vote for Obama and then Trump, right? Well, how do you vote for someone on the left and then the right? But I don't think most people think about politics in those terms. They think about who's going to improve our lives, who's going to change the things that we're angry about. And, politicians on the left and right can position themselves as populist agents of change. And I think the right is just better at least as of now. And that's why you're seeing so much right-wing success, not because of sudden love of nationalism or xenophobia or, the hardened kind of right-wing populist rhetoric, but just desperation and anger.
Glenn, I mean, to what extent do you think that's changed? Obviously, Bolsonaro's support has declined since he was elected, and the COVID pandemic has been part of that. I mean, one of the worst cases in the world in terms of just utter mismanagement. That said, he still seems to have retained core support, and it's not as if his favorability has cratered completely. So there does seem to be some staying power, which just makes me wonder that if people they just want someone to shake up the status quo and improve their lives in some way, no matter how bad they are otherwise. I mean, it seems that Bolsonaro hasn't done a particularly good job of improving anyone's life or most people's lives, yet it's not a foregone conclusion that he's done for in the next elections. I mean, is that fair? Is that a fair account?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's remember that, the 2020 election in the US had conditions that were about as bad for an incumbent president as you could possibly hope for, right? Like an out of control pandemic, a widespread perception that the federal government mismanaged it, a huge unemployment crisis, tens of million people out of work, one scandal after the next, suffocating Trump's presidency. And yet he almost won. I mean, by the popular vote total, which doesn't matter. It wasn't close, but by the electoral college vote total of 70,000 or 80,000 votes in one direction in a couple of key swing states. And Trump is currently in his second term. And so, I think the same is true with Bolsonaro. He has a core base, like a hardened far right, hard right ideological base, or even people who just as a cult of personality still believe in him, that will ensure he gets 25 to 30% of the vote, no matter what. He'll never fall below that ceiling, and absent some cataclysmic event, which pretty much guarantees in Brazil's presidential system, which is, that you have a first round of voting, the top two candidates, if one fails to get 50%, go to the runoff, and then suddenly he's running against a very polarizing figure like Lula, and he could win again because there's a lot of anti-worker party sentiment because of the perception that Lula is corrupt. So you're absolutely right. Right now, though, what's happening is Bolsonaro was very clever in 2018. What he did was he eroded the hardened resistance to him on the part of the bourgeois class and on the part of the oligarchical class, which is incredibly powerful in Brazil, and that you probably can't win an election if they're totally against you, by picking as his economics guru this guy named Paulo Guedes, who's an economist from the University of Chicago, very kind of stereotypical pro-austerity, pro-privatization. His model, his hero is Pinochet in Chile. And he said, Bolsonaro did during the campaign, look, I don't know anything about economic policy. It's never been an interest in mine. The person who's going to run the economy is Paulo Guedes. And I can't tell you how many educated, smart, elites I heard saying, and who said both before the election and after, oh, I didn't vote for Bolsonaro, I voted for Paulo Guedes. And then when he got Sergio Moro in, he brought a huge other component in with him. But what's happening now is Brazil is so isolated, it's almost impossible to overstate how out of control this coronavirus is. And it's the variant form of it, which obviously spreads much more quickly, and I'm convinced increasingly is also more lethal and more dangerous. You see people anecdotally just dying at much higher rates. 50% of the ICU wards are filled with people under 40. He is clearly to blame for that. And what's happening is, other countries are now isolating themselves from Brazil, closing their borders to anything that has to do with Brazil. And just a perception is being created that Brazil is kind of this cesspool of disease and mismanagement. And there's a huge concern on the part of the elite class, on the part of agribusiness, on the part of banks, that international capital is fleeing, and that Brazil will not be able to recover its image in the world with a second Bolsonaro term. The problem is that, they look at what happened in January 6th at the Capitol and they speak of it with contempt, the Bolsonaro movement does, because they think that it was just so lame. And Bolsonaro's primary project is to free up the commercial trade of firearms, basically clearly arming the substantial minority of people that are likely to be willing to go into the streets and engage in violence in his defense. He's definitely going to claim, if he loses, that it was the byproduct of fraud. He did it in the first election before the election was held. He said the only way he could lose is if the Workers' Party cheats. And the bigger concern I think that people have is not so much that he legitimately wins a second term, although that's definitely possible, but that if he doesn't, it's very easy to see how there could be serious civil unrest or even something resembling civil armed conflict.
Can you talk a little bit about, I mean, that's the one thing that's, as someone who doesn't know Brazil very well, that I was struggling a little bit reading your book, though, about how some of these divisions in society work. And again, I think there's we can use this again as to talk about sort of bigger pictures about this entire phenomenon globally. But it's striking to me, again, what little I know about sort of the rise of Lula and his party. I mean, you talk about the oligarchic class, which, again, from my very dilettantish knowledge of the broader region, is a phenomenon across a lot of Latin American countries. This oligarchic property-owning class, which has a massive concentration of wealth that, shames any sort of Gini coefficient talk that we have here in the United States about this sort of stuff. But they gave Lula a shot. Am I right about that? Like, basically, they were fine as, I guess PT was sort of, as you said, a center-left party and was trying to co-opt a lot of this stuff. What exactly happened that this dissolution came from? I mean, to a certain extent, I understand Judge Moro and this sort of, cabal of people trying to basically discredit a lot of this center-left stuff. But it seems to me, when you talk about the elites, I'm not exactly clear who that is. Where's the frustration coming from? And how is it that it's despite all of this, and again, I take your point that Bolsonaro's playing with the same sort of stuff that Trump was ahead of January 6th, and actually there's a much more, pointed threat given the situation, both the sort of, call it institutional shallowness compared to the United States, but also just, the historical baggage of it. Just talk to me a little bit more about how that's working out in Brazil right now, because I don't feel like I get that.
Yeah, it's interesting that question. Asked me. I asked Lula when I interviewed him in 2019 when he was still in prison. What happened was Lula ran before Lula was elected in 2002 to the presidency. He ran 3 other times prior to that and lost all 3 times. He almost won twice. He made the runoff. One time he didn't. And when he was getting ready to run again in 2002, he said, "I'm just not losing again. I'll do whatever I have to do to win." So one of the things he did was he selected as his vice presidential running mate this multi-millionaire who had been extremely successful in the textile business, who had lots of ties to bankers and to high finance. And that was obviously a sign. Like, obviously, I'm not Fidel Castro, right? I'm not Che Guevara. I'm not Hugo Chavez. I'm willing to play ball. And then he wrote this very famous, what's called Letter to the Brazilian People, where the whole point of which was to assure them that he was going to govern as a moderate and a non-ideologue. And, in Brazil, we complain a lot in the U.S. that we only have 2 effective parties, and sometimes, you don't fit within either of them, but you're forced to attach yourself to one. Brazil has the opposite problem. It has, I think now, it varies, but I think now it's like 28, 30 parties. So when you're elected president, you have to put together a ruling coalition in Congress to get anything done. And you end up partnering with a lot of, if you're a center-left party, centrist and even center-right, or just parties that are just transactional. Give us these ministries because that way we can take bribes as we run this of the politics, and we'll give you all our votes in Congress because we don't actually care about policy. So Lula, that's how we governed. And even though, as I said, millions of people got taken out of poverty with these really innovative anti-poverty programs that even like the World Bank and The Economist to this day praise and hold up as a model, the rich did very well, very, very well under Lula. It's not like there was redistribution going on. I mean, the economic growth redounded to their benefit to a great degree. And so when I went and interviewed him in 2019, he kept saying, Glenn, I'm in jail only because they were petrified that I was going to return to the presidency and they knew I was going to win. And I said, who is they? And he said, the elite, the rich. And I said, let me ask you, I don't understand that argument. I don't understand that you can say that credibly, because if you look at all data, the rich did better under your presidency than almost any other. And when you left, they were very happy with you. That's why you had an 87% approval rating. Why would they be so devoted to your return as though you're some kind of a threat to them when actually they flourished under your presidency? And he gave me this answer that I find fascinating and I think is so true and important, which is, he said, look, it's not just economics. You're right. They were fine with me from a perspective of how they were doing economically. The resentment is cultural. The emergence of this middle class in Brazil, a country which was the last country to eliminate slavery. So you not only have grave economic inequality, but also racial segregation and animus, meant that for the first time, rich people who would go to the airport would see poor black people from the favelas in the airport flying for the first time. Instead of taking a bus for 3 days to go to the northern part of Brazil, they could now fly, a few $100s. It's a huge change culturally, and you would commonly hear things like, our airports now look like bus stations. Or you would go to a shopping mall that had been a middle class or upper middle class shopping mall, and suddenly you would see black people there and people from the favelas who now had consumer power or going to college because of scholarship programs. And these kinds of cultural changes made them feel like the Brazil that they knew and where they had a comfortable place in had been slipping away. And I wasn't immediately convinced of that, but I think Bolsonaro's victory in a lot of ways is a testament to the veracity of Lula's view, because so much of Bolsonaro's appeal, just like Trump's, make America great again, let's go back to the 1950s or several decades ago when things were better, very much was a kind of regressive, restorative promise of let's go back to Brazil before these insane changes ruined all of our lives. And I think that did end up being a big part of the reason why they preferred Bolsonaro to Lula. I think that's now changing. It's so interesting when you read about the Supreme Court exonerating Lula and restoring his political rights. When that happened, the market in Brazil skyrocketed. And there was even talk that international capital is celebrating the fact that they now have somebody to defeat Bolsonaro. It's so ironic, right, that these economic sectors, international capital, are now praying for Lula's return when for decades they were petrified of him, but it's precisely because of the governing decisions that he made that you referenced.
So, I mean, this is really interesting because when I hear you talking about Brazil and reading your writing on Brazil, it almost tempts me to read into it to try to think to myself, oh, well, does this help explain how Glenn views U.S. politics? And feel free to push back, Glenn, if you think I'm reading too much into certain things. But I mean, one theme that I see is you saw how basically what might be called a deep state in Brazil undid the results or the potential results of a democratic election around the ballot box, kind of like a workaround that Lula, who was a man of the center left, and there was a way to kind of get around that potential result through the judicial class, through the courts, and Sergio Moro in particular. I wonder if that colors how you viewed the efforts to undo the election of Trump through the national security state, the intelligence services. How, that's maybe one way of looking at it. But also I think more broadly, wokeness is an issue that Damir and I have been talking about and writing about on Wisdom of Crowds for a while. And I got the sense that in your book, wokeness, quote unquote wokeness, obviously doesn't really apply to Brazil in quite the same way. But you do talk quite a bit about systemic racism and attacks against marginalized groups and how this superstructure is affecting people. And I almost got the sense that sometimes you're almost suggesting that, look, the U.S. has its problems. Yes, there is structural racism in the U.S., but look at what's happening in Brazil. That's like 5 or 10 times worse. Let's not go into woke excess or woke radicalism in the US, because that runs the risk of basically blowing something up, which is bad, but it's not. You see the excess in the US case, or you see how treating Trump as if he's existential runs the risk of going too far and undermining democratic institutions, again, in comparison to a place like Brazil, because the U.S. is fundamentally different, and we're fundamentally more stable and better on some of these issues for all of our faults. I mean, to what extent would you say that's an accurate representation of how you view some of these issues?
Yeah, well, obviously I have had extreme skepticism for whatever you want to call it, the national security blob, the military industrial complex, the deep state, the security state in the United States for many, many years, long before Trump and long before, I witnessed what happened in Brazil with Lula and Bolsonaro. Obviously, the Snowden reporting was very much about abuses by the national security and partner agencies. And Snowden came to me because of the years prior to that I had been writing about what I thought were these abuses primarily undertaken in the name of the war on terror, but also obviously very much residual abuses from the Cold War, when you really did have these institutions lurking in the dark who were controlling large parts of Washington, and the government putting limits on what they can and can't do, who are beyond the reach of democratic accountability because they stayed in power regardless of the outcome of elections. J. Edgar Hoover for decades, Allen Dulles running the CIA, and even when John Kennedy is elected after Eisenhower, he stays on. These were kind of these permanent power factions in Washington. And so I've always been skeptical of them, but definitely, I think it's an insightful point that you're making. It isn't so much the reporting that I did in 2019. What actually happened was in 2016, I alluded to earlier, the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, because what happened there was, the Workers' Party won in 2002, 2006, 2010, pretty easily. And then in 2014, because of all these crises in Brazil, they really thought, the center right and right thought, that this was finally their opportunity to win, to beat the Workers' Party at the ballot box, something that they were trying to do for 15, 16 years and couldn't do. And they got this kind of charismatic heir to a political dynasty who's a senator, who's good looking, well spoken, politically talented, and they thought, this is really our chance to win. And his name was Escio Neves, and he almost won, but he didn't. Dilma won. The Workers' Party won again in 2014. It was like 51-48, a super close election, and the right never accepted that defeat. They never accepted the legitimacy of that defeat. And they turned around 18 months later and they impeached her on preposterously trivial grounds. Like the most, corrupt gangsters in Latin America were leading the impeachment process against her, feigning indignation over these very trivial and manufactured corruption allegations. And that was really when I first started writing about Brazilian politics. That was when I created The Intercept Brazil, taking The Intercept and creating a newsroom in Brazil of young Brazilian journalists, because the media and so many power sectors were so united behind Dilma that I saw what happened. There were leaks showing that it was the military and bankers and the center right all working together to do this impeachment with the media. It was really a strike against the legitimacy of democracy to me. And that was in 2016. And then when I saw Trump win, and many of the same factions kind of uniting to create scandals like Russiagate, which, I've obviously been a skeptic of, it really seemed to me very similar. This idea that this is a pretender to the presidency, someone who had no right to win. Hillary Clinton called him an illegitimate president. And so a big part of how I viewed the Trump presidency from the outset was that these very powerful institutions that were opposed to him, largely for stylistic and comportmental reasons as opposed to policy reasons, were dead set on undermining and subverting his presidency. I think they tried hard to prevent him from winning in the first place through interference. And I view that as quite dangerous. However dangerous Trump might have been, I view that as being at least as dangerous. Trump was the legitimately elected president in 2016. He won that election fair and square. No one thinks there was voter fraud or whatever. And I think there was just a refusal to accept the fact that he had won and would actually now be governing the United States. And I saw right away this kind of formation of this idea, this attempt to depict Trump as this, unprecedented threat to American democracy, which I never saw him as, in part because American institutions are way too strong. As we were discussing earlier, you saw the media, get activated after years of dormancy under Bush and Obama, street protests, Congress, the courts intervening and invalidating his Muslim ban right away early on. It was clear he was going to encounter huge amounts of obstacles and barriers and resistance. And also just Trump is just too lazy. He's too slothful. He's too inept to be an effective, devoted destroyer of democracy. That was never really his project. He was just about his personal grievances and vendettas. And I never really took seriously the threat that Trump posed, in part because I was looking at it through the prism of real threats to democracy, like what happened in Brazil from 1964 to 1985. And I also, I think that having gone through the Snowden reporting, where I was, really overtly threatened in lots of different ways for a year with prison. If I had left Brazil, I couldn't leave Brazil for 14 months after I got back from Hong Kong and met Snowden. You guys probably remember my husband was notoriously detained in Heathrow Airport under a terrorism law. It was the British and the Americans trying to kind of intimidate us. After everything I went through there, and then, especially what I went through here in Brazil doing the reporting that we did, where there were, serious death threats all the time, constant threats from Bolsonaro himself to imprison me, culminating with an attempt actually to criminally charge me along with my sources with like 122 felony counts that if I had been convicted on, I would have gone to prison for, 380 years or whatever it was. This kind of narrative that the media had adopted for itself, this self-glorifying narrative that we are the resistance, we're in grave danger because press freedoms, it all just seemed very melodramatic and artificial to me, and I thought quite misleading. And I felt as though what was really going on was that a kind of binary politics got imposed on the United States, where everything was defined by your relationship to Trump. You were either pro-Trump or you were anti-Trump, and that's all that mattered. And if you were anti-Trump, it meant that you were one of the good guys, even if you were the ones who did the Iraq War and worldwide torture regime and rendition and all the stuff the CIA had done and the FBI had done as part of that war on terror. Even if you were part of the corporate elite that had run roughshod over the lives of tens of millions of people, as long as you were against Trump, you were embraced, you were empowered. And I think American liberalism, by joining itself at the hip with those kinds of elements, kind of absorbed a lot of their values of militarism, of jingoism. The whole script of people being clandestine agents of the Kremlin is a far-right script that came out of the McCarthy years, of J. Edgar Hoover and Joseph McCarthy. And it became everything. Everybody was a traitor who supported Trump. There was this huge polarization. And I got to the point where I really did believe that the greater danger to the United States was not Trump, but the way the tactics that were being embraced and the values that were being adopted, often kind of subconsciously or implicitly, in the name of fighting him. And sure, I do think that being in Brazil and seeing what real tyranny looks like, having gone through reporting where I felt like I've confronted actual dangers in connection with reporting, definitely shaped how I viewed some of that.
That's really interesting, because it makes me think about how my experiences in Egypt in the lead up to the 2013 coup against a democratically elected Islamist government of Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, how that, similar to how you're talking about the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, that very much shaped how I viewed Trump, that I saw what happened when here was an election result that was, the first free election, presidential election in Egypt's history. It produced a result that a lot of people didn't like, that a lot of people thought was personally threatening. Here was an Islamist in power. But then you have to be consistent about respecting democratic outcomes, and that's the true test. And so when I saw what happened to Trump, similar to what you're describing, I'm like, hey, he is personally threatening. I think Trump is really bad, but democratic outcomes are democratic outcomes. That said, I do want to push on one thing, and I worry that I underestimated Trump a little bit. I think that you and I, Glenn, were very much on the same page on these issues. We were critical of aspects of the Russia investigation, that it was going too far. I was skeptical about impeachment, at least the first time, but even to some extent the second time. But that said, isn't there a risk that in trying to understand what led to someone like Trump, there is a risk of letting our guard down? And I think that I had to contend with this after January 6th. I did not see that coming. I was caught off guard. To me, that was a real threat to American democracy, not to the same extent as a place like Brazil, let's say, but still, in terms of our own context in my own adult life, that came as a shock to a lot of us. And I did not think that Trump would do what he did. I did not think that the Republican Party would be this indulgent and this disrespectful of a legitimate democratic outcome this time in favor of Joe Biden. I mean, those criticisms, which I think are leveled to you, they were very much leveled against me. In the interest of self-criticism, how would you sort of account for that? Do you think we weren't tough enough, that we should have been tougher on about the risk that Trump presented in light of January 6th and the Capitol riots?
So, first of all, before addressing that part of what you said, let me just quickly kind of seize the Egypt example, because I think it's an important one to shed light on everything that you said. I think one of the early defining moments for me about how I ended up viewing the Trump era was in 2017 when Trump invited General Sisi to the White House, and it caused all kinds of moral indignation about how can it be the United States president could possibly embrace a despot, a dictator. That's not what United States presidents do. And I remember, feeling like I was in some kind of Alice in Wonderland world where reality had been completely inverted. The reason Egypt hadn't had a free election until Morsi won was because the United States for decades had supported Mubarak. Hillary Clinton called Mubarak a very close friend of my family. And when Morsi won, and then there was a military coup, I remember very, clearly that John Kerry was praising Sisi as kind of a restorer of democracy,
restoring
which is so
democracy,
often how
exactly.
the United States, and that's what the United States has been doing for decades, obviously. In Brazil, they didn't say, hey, we just overthrew a democratically elected leader and imposed a military dictatorship. They got Henry Luce and the Time magazine and the New York Times reporters to depict it as, oh, this was a corrupt and increasingly tyrannical government threatening Brazilian democracy. And we support this new government that is a temporary caretaker who is going to restore, military democracy, because that's their role as the military. All the time, every coup that the United States does gets depicted as pro-democracy, when in fact, the United States has obviously been undermining democracy whenever it wants. And so to see this kind of propaganda, oh, how can Trump possibly embrace it? The United States and the Saudis just alone, should have made that an impossible narrative. But you could see kind of the history of the United States being rewritten, where everybody who came before Trump was, whatever their ideology, at least devoted to core democratic values, and that Trump was this radical aberration from them. And I never viewed him that way. I always viewed him as just kind of a symptom rather than a cause of what was going wrong in the United States. So then you go to January 6th, and, my view of January 6th is, I don't think it's that uncommon for very energized and angry protests to spill into violence and riots. We saw it, many times over the summer where, mostly peaceful protesters gather, some get angry, some get violent. Suddenly a protest turns into a riot. Cops are being hurt. Protesters are being hurt. I think what happened here is it happened at the Capitol, kind of like the symbol of the stability of American democracy. And that's what became so jarring about it. At the end of the day, though, I don't share the kind of notion that this was a vindication of those who had said all along that Trump was genuinely a threat to democracy. There were 700, 800 people there. Most of them were older. None brandished a weapon inside the Capitol. 5 people died that day. 4 of them were Trump supporters, 2 of whom died of a heart attack, 1 of whom died of methamphetamine or amphetamine overdose, 1 of whom was shot point blank by a Capitol police officer in the neck. And then the only person who wasn't there as part of the Trump protest was Officer Brian Sicknick, and we don't really know how he died. We can assume that it was connected to the Capitol, but the narrative that was created at first, this savage mob bashed his head in with a fire extinguisher until he was dead. We know that's false. He might have died come from some kind of unintentional use of an unintentional killing through bear spray. They used bear spray, and he reacted in an unusual way and died from that. We don't know. But, the United States is the most militarized and powerful country in the world. There was no risk, in my view, that those 700 or 800 people, many of whom are boomers and older and unarmed, were going to overthrow the United States. I think it just ended up being poor preparation on the part of the Capitol. It's kind of shocking that in the 9/11 era, that building was so poorly fortified. But, a couple of hundred more armed police officers and they never would have gotten in, or they would have been expelled immediately. And if you look at what has happened since, there's been a lot of warnings. There was warnings on January 20th on Inauguration Day that they expected violent protests at state capitals. They militarized Washington, D.C., and nothing materialized. So, Trump was incredibly reckless. And when you go around claiming baselessly that there was systemic fraud in the vote count, that you really won by a landslide just because he couldn't admit, as his own ego that he lost, that is really a reckless and dangerous thing to do. And it's not surprising that it encouraged people who believed in him to take some extreme steps. That's a really serious allegation. Democracy has been stolen from you. But I think at the end of the day, if you look at the effect overall, the net effect of the Trump presidency on American democracy, I actually think American democracy was strengthened because it engaged so many more people in politics who had not been paying attention. It revitalized the idea of street protests and activism. It made the media more cantankerous and adversarial, at least to some factions. It kind of revitalize this idea that we're supposed to be involved in how we're governed, that we don't just elect a president and then go to sleep and let them do whatever they want. And I don't think even January 6th will ultimately be viewed as having been a genuine threat to the stability of American democracy.
So there you have it. That's the end of part 1. I hope you guys enjoyed it. We've got another 30 minutes for members only, where we just press Glenn on other issues beyond just the book, about his politics, about his views on foreign policy, and even on whether he might at some point consider joining a administration. Really interesting stuff. Hope you guys will join us as members. If you're not members yet, go to wisdomofcrowds.live/subscribe and join up. I'll see you guys over there.